All right, any questions before we get started? All right, we are still in Hebrews. Surprise, surprise. Hebrews is written in 7 sections. It has an introduction and a conclusion, with 5 main sections in the middle. The first of after the introduction, which starts initially with lifting up Jesus and glorifying who he is, it goes into the superiority of Jesus, talking about he's greater than the angels. And then he's also a human. But in the middle of that is a warning to pay close attention. And then, having established who Jesus is, it focuses on the role that will be emphasized in this letter, which is Jesus as high priest. And he's both a faithful high priest and a compassionate high priest. But again, in the middle, we find a warning not to follow after what the Israelites did in the desert and rebel against God, but that we also must be faithful to God. And then he comes to his main section of the letter, the great work of Jesus, where we are now. And instead of interspersing the warnings in the middle, he wants the middle to be his key point. So he moves the warnings to the beginning and to the end and brackets it that way. So we have a letter in which both we have teaching and we have warnings. And they're balanced out in a very deliberate way. So, talking about Jesus as high priest, he begins at the first major section talking about that Jesus is the high priest of a better priesthood. He's not a Levitical priest. He could not have been a Levitical priest because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi. And so he's a different priest. And we saw that section begin with who Melchizedek was and how Jesus was of a different order, of an order of Melchizedek. And so we came into chapter 8, and we have the better offering. The center section of this letter, section C here, is the better offering. Jesus is a high priest who brings a better offering. And he's describing so far, the author's been moving down. This whole section is written in the form of a chiasmus. I only included the first 7 points because I'm pretty confident we won't reach 7, but it continues on out in balancing points. But he is a better offering, and we are now here at the end of point 2, which is that the priesthood is a shadow of things to come. And last week we finished up talking about verse 13, speaking of a new covenant, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. And that's pretty much where we left off last week, but as I introduced last week, there's a concept here we need to take a side step and talk about. Which, if he's made the old law, right, if the first covenant was obsolete, what's the relationship to the law then? If you remember just a couple of verses ago, verse 10, he said, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. Now, if the law's been made obsolete, why is he writing them on our hearts? Why is he putting them in our minds?
Is it the substance of the law should still be there? It's just not all done to the letter or all of it. It's not, so that the substance is still there?
Yeah, that's kind of the key question. What is it? What is it that's there? And as you might expect, scholars have 2 views. This is the thing, scholars have either 2 or 3 views, sometimes 4 or 5. They never seem to have one. So there are 2 views on this. One is that the law has changed, and we just have a brand new law. That old law is sort of obsoleted along with the old covenant. And therefore, we don't need to do that any longer. For example, Hebrews 7:12, when the priesthood changed, there must be a change in the law. Would be a verse that you could cite to support this. And so the law being mentioned in 8 to 10, the law that's written on our hearts is a new law. It's not the old law. It's a new law that's written onto our hearts. Yeah.
Also, the old law was abused by the shepherds, people, the priests who were supposed to be helping. They just backed down all these other.
Well, yeah, they added a whole bunch of addendums, shall we say.
Yeah. So you really had to go. You had to depend on the priest, and that.
Well, but you had to depend on the priests for more than that, because you couldn't, we're going to see here shortly, you could not go into the Holy of Holies and offer a sacrifice. Who could go into the Holy of Holies? The high priest. And only once a year. Yeah.
The old law vanishing and obsolete, but yet the old law still serves a purpose.
And that's why there's another theory. There's a problem. I mean, what I've cited so far would seem to indicate that there's an old law and a new law. But there's also a problem, because what did Jesus say about the law? Did he say he had come to abolish the law and toss it out? No. He said, Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them." Unless there's an alternate view, is that the law's not been obsoleted and now we have a new law, but the old law has been transformed. That it has been fulfilled. And as it's fulfilled, then the old part drops away. Not gone, but it's still not quite as bad.
It hasn't completely vanished,
No.
it's just been changed.
And it's still just as valid as it was, but how we deal with it is, I mean, for example, there's provisions in the Constitution that allow for people who were not American citizens by birth to be in office. Because who was American citizens when the Constitution was put into effect? Nobody was being put into effect. So clearly, because of the Revolution, there were people who were born, right? Now, are those obsoleted in the sense? There's just as valid. If someone happened to have been born in 1750 and was still alive today, could they run for president? Yeah, they could. Not likely to happen. So that provision of the law remains in effect. It remains valid. It is still there. It's just, do we need to pay attention to it? No, because it's been fulfilled in the sense that no one's around that meets that qualification any longer. There are provisions in the law that are there. They're just as valid, but they're no longer operative in the sense that we don't need them anymore. Jesus has fulfilled the law. Yeah.
Sorry, Mark 9 is interesting because that's where the Pharisees, and I think representing the Herodians as well, come and ask Jesus about divorce.
Yeah.
Go back to Deuteronomy 24:1. And the idea is the law, well, because of the hardness of your hearts,
Right.
you know, it sort of, it didn't have to be tweaked, but, you know, and it's not Jesus saying, I'm abolishing that law. He says, we need to take you back to God's original intent about marriage. So.
Yeah, and there's such wisdom. Some of the things, for our first, as a new Christian, I found out that, the Bible allowed slavery. Right? Wow, how could it do that? I mean, it was God thinking, it's pretty much the same thing, the hardness of his heart. But when you look at what God, he has a lot of provisions in there about slavery. And when you look at what those provisions actually say, I mean, initially my thought was, it's not like slavery. But when you look at what it actually defined as a slave and how you were to treat a slave, really wasn't that much different than what we would now classify as an employee. Except you had additional obligations, and in the sense that one of the things that there's a Hebrew saying about slavery, because slavery disappeared within Judaism. You don't find a lot of slaves, except as the very rich who were probably questionably how much they were following. But there was not a big institutional slavery issue in Judaism, because the rabbis had figured out long before that, they come up with a saying, he who buys a slave buys a master. Because your obligations to your slave are just as much as the slave's obligations to you, and you end up basically binding yourself to them. And God's view of slavery was actually pretty well stated in a verse that was puzzling for me for a long time, which is, if you had sold yourself as an indentured slave, right? So in other words, I'm going to work for you for 5 years, and you will then, provide me room and board or whatever. It's more what we would actually call more of an economic contract. But you were going to say, and you got to the end of that period, and you go, wow, this is a really good life. He's a nice master. I kind of like this idea. I'm going to stay a slave. I'm going to go ask him if I could just stay a slave. What did God say in that situation?
Put the all through the year?
Yeah. Nail his ear to a wall. Well, is that something you really want to go through? Does this prospect of slavery look good any longer? Well, what's God saying about that? Who's he punishing? He's punishing the person who wants to stay as a slave. It's not a situation we should strive to be in. So, coming back to the status of the law, and this is the one I actually believe, the law has been changed. I have problems with it, particularly because of Jesus' statement in Matthew and others. I think the law has been transformed and, more importantly, fulfilled. And so when it says, I'm going to write the law in your heart, it's the same law. It's a law that has been fulfilled by Jesus Christ. And in that sense, made perfect. If you remember that we talked about the concept of being made perfect, how Jesus was made perfect, right? It's not that he was imperfect, but that he fulfilled his potential. He fulfilled what was set out for him to do. That, when he was born a child in the manger, had he completed everything he needed to do? No. He still needed to live his life, have his ministry, die and suffer on the cross. Was he imperfect? No. He just hadn't finished what it needed to do. And that's sort of the concept of the law. When we look at the Old Testament law, it's not that the Old Testament law is imperfect. It's just that it's in process. Probably a better way to think of it. And that process was fulfilled with Jesus Christ. And so when we look at the Old Testament law, it's the same law that's written into our hearts. It remains just as valid, even if portions of it have now been completed and fulfilled. Okay, moving on, verse 9. Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. So here we've moved into a more detailed discussion of the Old Covenant. And what's happening in this whole transition here through this whole chiasmus, and it's going to key off of this verse in chapter 9, verses, I think it's 10, 11, 12. We're going to see this is the old system, which is incomplete, but then we have the true offering, of which this is merely a shadow, and then it'll close out the chiasmus talking about the true offering. So here we're moving down to point 3, the Old Covenant. And he's saying how now even the Old Covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. Now, I should point out that the word covenant doesn't appear in the text. It's just now the first, and most translations go ahead and add the word covenant just to make it clearer. But there are some people who argue that this should be the first tabernacle rather than the first covenant. I think the arguments for that are a little weak. The tabernacle hasn't been mentioned since verse 5. And while it's possible with the word now that the author is referencing back to verse 5, I think it's more likely, just given the overall flow and context of the argument, that that he's speaking about the first covenant here. But notice the qualification he puts on sanctuary. But even the first covenant had regulations for worship and what kind of sanctuary? Earthly. And you can see he's beginning to set the stage for where he's going here. That the first is an earthly covenant. Verse 2. For a tent was set up, and in the first place were the lampstand, the table, and the bread of presence. This was called the holy place. And the Greek word here is the word for tent. That's just what it means. It's a simple tent. And some translations, put in tabernacle to make it sound, sort of official. I think that actually confuses the author's point here. After all, wasn't there a temple in existence? Even if you argue this was written afterwards, which I don't think it was, there had been a temple, a physical temple. So why does he suddenly go back to start talking about a tent? Right? The original one was a tent. When they were in the wilderness, they didn't build a stone mason structure every night. They had to put up a tent wherever they went. So the original one was a tent. Some possible reasons for this is some Jews questioned the temple, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, for example. Although I don't see any indication in the letter that the people he's writing to, other than possibly his reference to the tent rather than to the temple. I don't see any other reference that would seem to indicate that. But there were some Jews who questioned the temple, particularly because who built it? Herod. He was a fine, upstanding, community service-oriented person, wasn't he?
I'm stretching it. The tent was mobile. And when we have on our hearts, it goes with us.
That's possible. Yeah. I hadn't considered that one, but that's definitely possible. And it would actually fit a little bit into his argument in the sense that he's arguing that it goes wherever we are as opposed to the physical structure. I guess one of the arguments against using tent there would be this is the one that's going away. So that would actually make a better argument for over here than up here. But interesting. I'll think about that for a while. Talking about the temple, you start digging into a lot of temple issues, shall we say, as opposed to talking about the tabernacle keeps the focus on God and serving God, and allows the author to just sort of move all that stuff, off to the side. Another aspect of this is that, remember, some people argue that this letter was written to Rome, we talked about. So the people in Rome may not have been familiar with the temple, but they would have been familiar with Scripture. And Scripture talks about the tabernacle. For example, when he's talking about the Old Covenant, right, he's talking about Exodus 24. And so if he just continues right on to Exodus 25, talk about the tabernacle, he would be talking about the tent. And finally, one argument I came up with, I didn't see anywhere else, is that, to me, when I think of a tent, I think of something temporary. Something that you're going to use for a short period of time and you're going to pack it up. As opposed to a temple that's there. It's physical. And for example, if I were to say the Holy of Holies out of context here, it's probably, but say someone comes up to you and says Holy of Holies, right? Where are you going to think? You're going to think probably the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is where that was. And you associate that. You associate the fact that the Temple of the Holy of Holies was in the Sinai. Which, on a little side note, some archaeologists think they may have found where it was. They found a settlement that they believe where the Jews had settled, and they found a series of posts dug into the holes that they believe where the poles may have been, or where the Holy of Holies tent was set up. So, is that what we think about the Holy of Holies, or do we think about the Temple Mount? So when he talks about the tent, he may also, again, be referencing the temporary nature. The fact that the tent just represents and not is the Holy of Holies. So the first part of the tent, you'll see the author talks about two here, the inner and the outer. He has the lampstand, which was the 7-branch lampstand from Exodus 25:31. The table and the bread of presence, which was the 12 loaves laid out in two rows. This was, for example, the bread that David took. You remember that. He went into the temple and grabbed the bread because his men were hungry. (9, 3, and 4). Behind the second curtain was the first part of the tent called the Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, completely covered in gold, and in it were the jar holding the manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the tablets of the covenant. So the Most Holy Place, the Holy of Holies, which is, we take that as a term in and of itself. What it really is, it's a Hebrew expression for expressing an emphasis on how holy it was. They just take the word and they repeat it. Repetition was a very common way of emphasizing. So you could have the good, or the good of the good. Cream of the crop is sort of another way we would put it maybe. But the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, where there was the golden altar of incense. And if you're really good and sharp on your Old Testament, you just realize there's an issue here. Because where was the altar of the incense? That was outside. And behind the second curtain was the part of the tent called the Most Holy Place, which had the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was inside, but the altar was outside. And there's some dispute here. Some argue that this is the censer or the shovel. It's not clear why Paul would single that out. That seems a little strange. It is key to note here that he said, which had the golden altar. He doesn't say that it was, which was inside was the golden altar. The altar was placed directly in front of the curtain. It was often considered part of the inner sanctuary, even though it was just outside. So then you have the Ark of the Covenant, completely covered in gold. One little historical significance here is when Paul or whoever was writing this, where was the Ark of the Covenant?
By then, wasn't it like gone?
No one knows.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last message of the Ark of the Covenant is when Josiah told the priest to put it into the temple in 2 Chronicles 35:3. There's a tradition mentioned in Maccabees that Jeremiah hid it, but we don't know if Maccabees, Catholics consider that inspired, Protestants don't. I don't, for reasons we talked about when we went through the class of the Bible. So it may be true, just because it's not inspired doesn't mean it's not true, but it doesn't mean it is true. So it's an account that's out there. Jeremiah hid it. There have been very tantalizing rumors from time to time about where the Ark might be. Some say it's in Scotland. What's that?
North Africa.
Out in Nairobi, no, Ethiopia. Excuse me, Ethiopia. There's several different claims, and everyone, well, the Scottish, it's other people are claiming that it's in there. The people there are not saying anything about it. The ones who do claim to know where it is always come up to about that close to being able to reveal it, but never seem to be able to quite cover that last amount of distance. So where it is, we don't know, and whether it was destroyed. I mean, one possibility is it was taken and melted down. And on the other hand, it could be under the Temple Mount someplace, and will be revealed in God's timing. We don't know. They didn't know either. So he's talking here again about the temple in Exodus 25, not necessarily the temple. And the thing is I think anybody reading this in the first century, when the temple was there and in operation, there would have been this, yeah, but it doesn't have the ark. Is that just, yeah, it doesn't have the ark. And remember, you have 2 Maccabees and all these rumors about Jeremiah hiding it. If he had hid it and this was now God setting up his new temple, why didn't they find why didn't God have them find the ark and place it back in there? So I think there's a lot going in here subtly in terms of the author's argument. The reason he kind of brings up, he doesn't make a big point of this, and in all honesty, maybe I'm making too much of it, and it's not an actual point. But it's possible that his very mention of the ark and the fact that it's there is just one more way towards making his overall argument. So, hold the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff, and the tablet of the covenant. Again, all three not in that temple in Jerusalem. Verse 5. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the place of atonement. Where was the place of atonement? We cannot discuss these things in detail now. Which, if you have been following on with great interest to what the writer has been saying, is a major disappointment. If it's been tedious to the point of boredom, is a great relief. But it does signal in the author's mind, whenever you see little phrases like this, you should ask yourself, why does the author say that? In fact, you could ask yourself about anything you read in there, but particularly little side statements like this. Why does the author say that? And here, I think he's gone up to the edge of point that he wants. He wants to lay this stuff out, but that's not his major focus of what he's going to be talking about. Okay? He would have a lot to say on it if it was relevant to his overall argument. So he needs to mention it, but not get down into the details about it. So he's going to take the argument off. It also, by the way, is a nice little phrase. Do you remember that controversy about the incense, the censer? Right? Well, this could explain why he skimmed over that very quickly and alluded to the fact that the bowl of incense was outside, inside. He was a little bit. We may have wanted a more precise placement by him. But that wasn't his main point. He's skimming over this stuff because he wants to get to his main argument, which we will pick up on in verse 6. His main argument, as we will see, is not the physical things themselves, not the location of the tabernacle, but the offering, what was done there. Because that's where he's going. He's going to go to the fact that he did not have a true offering. There's something going to be problematic about it. Let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer.